A king who never strayed, a ruler who never bowed to idols, a leader who strengthened a nation but remained in the shadows. Who was Jotham, and why is his name often forgotten? In our last video, we talked about King Uzziah, the 10th king of Judah, a man who brought prosperity, expanded borders, and strengthened the military. But his downfall was pride. When he arrogantly entered the temple to burn incense, something only priests were allowed to do. God struck him with leprosy. His once glorious reign ended in isolation, hidden from his people. His son Jotham then became king. This is the story of the 11th king of Judah, a king who ruled with wisdom, strength, and faithfulness. He reigned for 16 years, led great building projects, and won victories in war. Yet, despite his accomplishments, history barely mentions his name. Why? Was it because he avoided scandalous sins like some of his ancestors? Was it because he ruled righteously but never sought attention? Or was it because, despite his faithfulness, the people's hearts were already turning away from God? Jotham was different from most kings of Judah. He ruled during a time of growing corruption. When his own people refused to follow his example, he strengthened his kingdom, but could he save it from spiritual decay? This is part of our Deep Bible Story series, where we explore the lives of biblical kings, their triumphs, failures, and the lessons they leave for us today. Before we begin, a quick note. Many people confuse the kingdoms of Judah and Israel. By the time Jotham became king, Israel and Judah were separate nations. The northern kingdom, Israel, was ruled by kings who had abandoned God. Meanwhile, Judah still had kings from David's line, some faithful, some corrupt. Jotham was a king of Judah, and his reign took place during a politically dangerous time, with threats from within and enemies rising on every side. As always, we hope these videos help you grow closer to God. We've added timestamps in the description so you can jump to any section that interests you. If this video gives you a fresh perspective on Jotham's story, share it with a friend who needs to see how faithfulness matters, even when the world turns away. Now, let's dive into the story of Jotham, the forgotten king who stood firm when the world around him was falling apart. The palace of Judah had always been a place of strength, a fortress in the heart of Jerusalem. It was within these stone walls that Jotham was born, a prince destined to rule. He grew up surrounded by the glory of his father, King Uzziah, a man whose name carried power, respect, and divine blessing. Under Uzziah's reign, Judah flourished. Cities were fortified, armies expanded, and wealth poured into the kingdom. The economy thrived, and Judah's enemies feared its warriors. Prosperity seemed certain. From the moment Jotham could walk, he watched his father's victories unfold, witnessing a kingdom at its peak, learning from a king who seemed unstoppable. But power has a price, and Jotham would soon learn that even the greatest of men can fall. At first, Jotham only saw his father's triumphs. He stood at his side as foreign envoys bowed before Judah's might. He listened as the elders and priests praised Uzziah's wisdom. The young prince must have admired his father, believing Judah's golden age would last forever. Then the whispers began, first among the palace servants, then among the guards, and soon, even the prophets came to the royal court with troubled hearts. Jotham knew something was wrong. His father had changed. The once humble king had become restless and impatient. Victories were no longer enough. The crown, the throne, the riches, none of it satisfied him. He began to speak of his own greatness, forgetting that his success came from the Lord. Then one day, Uzziah did the unthinkable. The temple of the Lord stood as a sacred place, a place only priests could enter, where the presence of God was honored. But Uzziah wanted more. One fateful day, he walked into the temple, not to worship or pray, but to take what was not his. He lifted the incense, standing where only the sons of Aaron could stand. The high priest and his fellow priests rushed forward, horrified. "My lord, stop! This is not for you. The Lord has commanded that only his priests shall serve before him." But Uzziah did not listen, and then judgment fell. A gasp, a cry of horror. The priests staggered back as a single white mark appeared on Uzziah's forehead, leprosy. Jotham had never seen his father afraid before. But that day, Uzziah fled from the temple, covering his face, trembling in fear. The once mighty king, the warrior who had crushed armies, the ruler who had made Judah strong, was now an outcast, marked by God's judgment. From that moment on, Uzziah was banished. He lived in isolation, his reign effectively over. His title remained, but his power was gone, and Jotham, still young and untested, had to take his place. It's one thing to rule, but another to rule while another man still wears the crown. Jotham was not a usurper. He did not seize power or demand the throne, but the weight of leadership fell on his shoulders nonetheless. He had to make decisions, defend Judah, uphold justice, all while the true king lived in exile, unclean and broken. Did they ever speak? Did Uzziah ever warn his son of the dangers of pride? Did he ever say, "Jotham, do not make my mistake. Remember where your strength comes from"? Or was there only silence between them? Jotham had been trained for this. He had studied Judah's laws, watched his father rule, and learned the art of war. But nothing prepares you for the moment when responsibility is no longer a lesson, but a reality. He was young, too young, many believed. The elders of Judah still looked to Uzziah, even though he could no longer lead. The priests still remembered the man who had dared to enter the temple. Jotham was caught between generations, between the past mistakes of his father and the uncertain future of Judah. And yet, he did not waver. Unlike his father, Jotham never overstepped his bounds. He never sought power for himself. He respected the temple, honored the priests, and remained faithful to God. He ruled with wisdom, strengthening Judah without arrogance. But there was one problem. The people, his people, did not follow his example. Jotham had watched his father fall, but Judah had not learned the lesson. Idolatry was growing, the influence of foreign nations was creeping in, and the prophet's warnings became more urgent. The people continued to drift away from God. Jotham ruled for 16 years. He built great cities, defeated his enemies, and strengthened Judah. And in all that time, he never turned away from God. But despite his faithfulness, his people did not follow him. It's a tragic truth in history. A righteous leader cannot always create a righteous nation. Jotham would be remembered as one of the few kings of Judah who did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He remained faithful, wise, and strong. He was never humiliated like his father, and he was never defeated like so many before him. But when his reign ended, his people remained unchanged, and the darkness that had begun in his time would soon consume the nation. Because after Jotham came Ahaz, a king who would undo everything his father had built. Jotham's story is not just about a prince who ruled in his father's place. It's about learning from the mistakes of those who came before us. The Bible tells us, "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." Jotham saw firsthand what happens when a man allows pride to take control. He saw the consequences of arrogance and chose a different path. But what about us? Are we learning from the mistakes of others? Are we humble enough to take correction, or are we walking toward destruction? Have we allowed pride to blind us to the truth? A wise person does not wait to fall before they learn the lesson. They look at those who have fallen and walk a different path. Jotham learned. Will we? Jotham stood at the window of his palace, looking out over Jerusalem, the city of God. The walls stood high, unshaken, a fortress that had stood for generations. Judah's economy was thriving, its military strong, and its king a man of wisdom and faith. But power does not guarantee safety, and strength does not guarantee survival. Outside Judah's borders, the world was shifting. Enemies were watching, and war was coming. To the outside world, Judah looked invincible. Under Jotham's rule, cities had been fortified, the kingdom's defenses reinforced, and the wealth of Judah had only grown. The Ammonites, a longtime enemy, had been defeated and forced to pay tribute. The streets of Jerusalem were filled with gold, wheat, and barley from conquered nations. But true danger is rarely obvious at first. While Judah's walls stood strong, cracks had already begun to form. Jotham's own people were turning away from God. The prophets warned of judgment, yet their words were ignored. The nation was becoming divided, not by armies, but by its own spiritual decay. And the wolves were waiting for the right moment to strike. Jotham had crushed the Ammonites when they rebelled, forcing them to pay tribute for 3 years. But no enemy forgets defeat. Somewhere beyond Judah's borders, the Ammonite leaders gathered in secret. Their tribute to Judah was not a sign of surrender. It was a wound they intended to heal with blood. They waited. They watched. They whispered to themselves, "Judah is powerful now, but for how long?" And they were not the only ones preparing for war. To the north, the kingdom of Israel was collapsing. Once a mighty nation, Israel had turned its back on God. King after king fell by the sword, assassinations and betrayals leaving the nation unstable and vulnerable. The new ruler, Pekah, had seized the throne through murder. He was a man of violence and desperation, determined to keep Israel from falling apart. and that meant Judah could not be ignored. Pekah saw Jotham's success and resented it. He knew that without allies, Israel would be crushed by the rising Assyrian Empire. So he turned to Rezin, the king of Aram, Syria. Together they made a deadly decision. But the greatest threat of all was not the Ammonites, Israel, or Aram. It was Assyria. Far to the northeast, a superpower was rising, an empire unlike anything the world had ever seen. Assyria did not conquer lands, they erased them. King Tiglath-Pileser III was not content with ruling an empire. He wanted the world. His armies were not just strong, they were unstoppable. His soldiers did not just defeat their enemies, they destroyed their cities, enslaved their people, and crushed any hope of rebellion. And now, Assyria was marching south. Jotham sat in his throne room, his advisors whispering urgently around him. The news had arrived. The Ammonites were waiting for their chance to rise again. Israel and Aram were forming an alliance, pressuring Judah to join them. Assyria was expanding, swallowing kingdoms one by one. It was only a matter of time before Judah became the next battleground. His father, Uzziah, had been a warrior king. Would Jotham take the same path? Would he march to war? Would he seek an alliance? Or would he stand alone, trusting in God rather than the shifting alliances of men? Jotham had always ruled differently than other kings. He had built, not conquered. He had strengthened, not boasted. He had walked with God, not sought his own power. But now, Judah stood on the edge of destruction. The decision he made next would shape the future of his kingdom forever. Jotham's kingdom was physically strong but spiritually weak. The enemies outside were not as dangerous as the corruption within. The Bible tells us, "Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the guards stand watch in vain." Psalm 127:1. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Deuteronomy 31:6. Jotham had built strong walls, but was his faith strong enough to stand against the storm? What about us? When life looks strong on the outside, is our faith strong on the inside? Do we trust in worldly security, or do we trust in God alone? Are we standing firm in righteousness, or are we allowing compromise to creep into our lives? The greatest battles are not fought on the battlefield, they are fought in the heart. Will we stand firm when the storm comes? Jotham walked alone, not because he was weak or uncertain, but because he chose righteousness over popularity. In an era when kings built idols instead of kingdoms, when rulers sought glory instead of obedience, when power was measured in conquests instead of character, Jotham was different. He never bowed to idols, never abused his power, and never let pride consume him. He was a king who walked with God. But what happens when a righteous king rules over an unrighteous people? Most kings in ancient times sought expansion. They wanted to crush their enemies, claim new lands, and make their names legendary. Jotham had a different vision. He didn't seek more land or chase more war. He focused on one thing: building. 2 Chronicles 27:3-4 says, "He built the upper gate of the house of the Lord, and he did extensive work on the wall of Ophel. He built towns in the hill country of Judah and forts and towers in the wooded areas." While other kings sought personal glory, Jotham fortified his kingdom. He strengthened the walls of Jerusalem, ensuring the capital was secure. He built military fortresses, reinforcing Judah's defenses before war could come. He saw what other kings ignored. Victory is not only about winning battles, it's about being prepared for them. And yet, for all his wisdom and faithfulness, Judah's people did not follow his example. Jotham's reign was one of the few in Judah's history that was free of scandal. Unlike his father, Uzziah, he never let pride drive him to overstep his bounds. Unlike his son, Ahaz, he never compromised his faith. And like so many kings before him, he never turned to idols. 2 Kings 15:34-35 says, "He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father Uzziah had done, but the people continued their corrupt practices." Jotham was righteous, but his people were not. They still worshipped idols, practiced corruption, and ignored the warnings of the prophets. He must have watched it happen with a heavy heart. He could build walls, but he could not change hearts. He could fortify cities, but he could not force his people to follow God. He could walk in righteousness, but he could not make his people do the same. And so, while Judah stood strong physically, it was crumbling spiritually. Perhaps the most powerful thing about Jotham's reign is not what he did, but what he refused to do. His father Uzziah had made one fatal mistake. Uzziah was a mighty king, a victorious warrior, a wise ruler. But in the end, his pride consumed him. He thought he could walk into the temple of God and take on the role of a priest. He lifted the incense, standing in a place only the priests of God were allowed to stand, and God struck him with leprosy. Jotham was just as powerful as his father. He was just as wise, but he knew his place. He never entered the temple in arrogance. He never overstepped his boundaries. He never forgot that his strength came from obedience, not ambition. That is what set him apart. 2 Chronicles 27:6 tells us his secret. Jotham grew powerful because he walked steadfastly before the Lord his God, not because he had a great army, a vast kingdom, or a powerful economy, but because he walked with God. For 16 years, Jotham ruled with faithfulness. He protected Judah, honored God, and never wavered. And yet, despite everything, the people refused to change. They still worshipped false gods, chose corruption over righteousness, and ignored the prophets. Jotham had to ask himself, what happens when a leader follows God, but the people do not? Because the moment Jotham was gone, Judah's true state would be revealed, and the truth was terrifying. Jotham's story is a rare example of obedience in the midst of rebellion. He did what was right, even when no one followed him. The Bible tells us, "The Lord is with you when you are with him. If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will forsake you." Chronicles 15:2. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight. Proverbs 3:5-6. But here's the question. Are we walking with God, even when others around us are not? Are we seeking to build our lives in faithfulness, or are we being influenced by a world turning away from God? Are we trusting in our own strength, or are we remaining steadfast before the Lord? It's easy to be faithful when others are watching, but what about when no one else is? Will we still walk with God? The war drums echoed across the valleys of Judah. Messengers arrived in Jerusalem, breathless with the news everyone feared. The Ammonites had rebelled. For years they had been forced to pay heavy tribute to Judah, a tax reminding them of their defeat under King Uzziah. But now, with Uzziah gone and Jotham ruling in his place, the Ammonites saw an opportunity. They whispered, "The new king is weak. He is not a warrior like his father." They were wrong. Jotham had spent years strengthening Judah's walls, building fortresses and fortifying defenses. He was also ready for war. This would not be a long, drawn-out conflict. It would be swift and decisive, a lesson the Ammonites would never forget. The Ammonites assumed Jotham would hesitate. They believed Judah had prospered in peace and forgotten how to fight. They thought a righteous king would seek diplomacy instead of battle, but they assumed wrong. Jotham's spies had been watching them for months. He knew the rebellion was coming before the first Ammonite soldier crossed the border, and so he struck first. 2 Chronicles 27:5 says, "Jotham waged war against the king of the Ammonites and conquered them. That year, the Ammonites paid him 100 talents of silver, 10,000 cores of wheat, and 10,000 cores of barley." The victory was total. The Ammonites were crushed, their cities raided, their warriors defeated, and their rebellion extinguished before it could grow. For the next 3 years they were forced to send even more tribute, 100 talents of silver, 10,000 measures of wheat, and 10,000 measures of barley. But war always comes with consequences. Jotham had won, but he had also painted a target on Judah's back. With every battle won and every enemy subdued, Judah's name grew greater. Wealth invited jealousy, and strength invited challenges, because in the shadows Assyria was watching. The Northern Empire, led by King Tiglath-Pileser III, had already begun its merciless march across the region. They saw Jotham's victory over the Ammonites and had one question: would Judah stand with them or against them? Would Judah be their ally or their next conquest? Jotham had won this battle, but the war for Judah's survival was far from over. Jotham acted decisively when the time for war came. But this raises an important question. How do we know when to fight and when to trust God to fight for us? Exodus 14:14 says, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Ecclesiastes 3:8 says, "There is a time for war and a time for peace." Are we stepping into battles God never called us to? Are we waiting for God when He's calling us to act? Do we prepare ourselves in times of peace so we are ready when the battle comes? Jotham knew when to strike. Do we? The world was changing, and a storm named Assyria was coming. For decades, the kingdoms around Judah had fought small wars, shifting power back and forth. But now a new empire was rising in the north, one that didn't just defeat enemies, but erased them from history. At the center of this growing beast stood Tiglath-Pileser III. In Isaiah 10:7, the Bible describes Assyria's purpose, but it is in his heart to destroy, to cut off nations, not a few. Assyria's strategy was simple and terrifying: invade swiftly, destroy completely, and deport the survivors so they could never rise again. In the days of Pekah, king of Israel, Assyria had already taken cities like Ijon, Abel-Beth-Makkah, Genoa, Kadesh, and Hazor, Kings 15:29. Now, Assyria was coming for the south. Israel and Aram, Syria, began to panic. Their only chance of survival was a military alliance, so they turned to Judah, to Jotham. They demanded he join their coalition against Assyria. Stand with us, fight with us, or be destroyed with us. It was a deadly choice. If Jotham refused, Israel and Aram might turn on Judah first. If he joined, he'd be dragged into a war against a virtually unstoppable empire. He had a decision to make: trust in alliances with men or stand alone and trust in God. Jotham did not waver. He knew Judah's history. Every time Judah trusted in foreign alliances, disaster followed. His grandfather, Amaziah, had trusted mercenaries from Israel. Betrayal followed. His father, Uzziah, had trusted his own strength. God struck him with leprosy. Jotham would not repeat their mistakes. He refused the alliance, making powerful enemies. 2 Kings 15:37 says, "In those days, the Lord began to send Rezin, king of Aram, and Pekah, king of Israel, against Judah." Israel and Aram, once potential allies, became Judah's biggest threats. War loomed. But Jotham would not live to see it. Even as the world plunged into chaos, his time as king was drawing to a close. His son, Ahaz, would inherit the storm he tried to avoid. Jotham had everything to fear: powerful enemies, shifting alliances, the looming shadow of Assyria. Yet he did not give in to fear. He did not trust in men, armies, or political deals. He chose to trust in God alone. But how easy is that for us today, when we're faced with uncertainty, pressure mounting, and people around us expecting compromise? Do we stand firm like Jotham, even if it makes us enemies? Or do we bow to fear, seeking short-term solutions that cost us long-term faith? Psalm 27 declares, "Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God." Jotham could have joined the alliance with Israel and Aram. It would have been easier. He could have gained protection, avoided immediate war, and secured temporary safety. But that's the problem. Human solutions only provide temporary safety. Jeremiah 17:5 warns, "Cursed is the man who trusts in man and makes flesh his strength, whose heart turns away from the Lord." Jotham had to choose: trust in men or trust in God. And he chose God. Would we have done the same? His decision came at a price. It made him enemies. Israel and Aram turned on him, preparing for war. His kingdom was in immediate danger. Imagine standing firm in faith, only to see enemies on your doorstep because of it. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Matthew 5:10. Jotham chose to trust God, even when it hurt. Do we have that same courage? Jotham made the right choice, but his son, Ahaz, would do the opposite. Jotham trusted in God, and Judah was safe. Ahaz trusted in men, and Judah was almost destroyed. Isaiah 7:9 records the warning given to Ahaz: "If you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all." That warning is for us too. When trials come and pressure mounts, will we choose the easy compromise or the hard obedience? Because if we do not stand firm in faith, we will not stand at all. What is your Assyria? That thing which fills you with fear and tempts you to compromise. What alliances have you made in your life, trusting in human security rather than God's promises? Where is God calling you to stand firm, even when it feels risky? We must ask ourselves, do we live like Jotham, trusting in God's strength? Or like Ahaz, seeking worldly solutions and risking disaster? Faith in God isn't about taking the easiest path, it's about taking the right one. Jotham stood strong. Will you? After 16 years of ruling Judah with wisdom, strength, and faithfulness, Jotham's time came to an end. He left behind a kingdom that was physically strong but spiritually weak. Despite all he built, Judah's spiritual decline continued. Idolatry thrived, prophets were ignored, and his own son did not walk in his ways. When Jotham closed his eyes for the last time, he left behind a strong kingdom, yet his son would unravel it. It forces us to ask, are we building something that will last beyond our lifetime? Proverbs 13:22 says, "A good person leaves an inheritance for their children's children, but inheritance is more than money. It's faith, wisdom, and integrity." If you were gone tomorrow, what legacy would you leave? Jotham reminds us that faithfulness matters, but we must also pass it on. Otherwise, everything we build could be destroyed in a single generation. Are you building something that will stand the test of time? Jotham was a rare king. He never wavered, never bowed to idols, and never abused his power. Yet history barely whispers his name. Why? Because he had no scandal, no rebellion, no fall from grace, just quiet obedience. In a world that chases recognition, power, and personal glory, Jotham's life proves something profound. Faithfulness is not about being noticed, it's about being steadfast. He never bowed to idols, never let pride corrupt him, and never abandoned God. Despite his faithfulness, Judah drifted further from righteousness. Did his obedience matter? Yes, because God's definition of success isn't about fame or immediate results, it's about obedience. Jotham ruled righteously in a world that was crumbling. He wasn't famous, but he was faithful. And in God's kingdom, faithfulness matters more than fame. How often do we chase recognition? How often do we measure success by who notices us? Jotham's life challenges that mindset. He wasn't the loudest or the most famous, but he was one of the few kings who never wavered. That's true success, not seeking the spotlight, but standing firm. So will you follow God if no one notices? Will you remain faithful when you don't see immediate results? God sees what the world overlooks. Jotham's son, King Ahaz, would take the throne and burn everything his father built to the ground. Idolatry, corruption, betrayal, the complete abandonment of God, and a kingdom on the verge of collapse. Everything Jotham stood for, his own son destroyed. What went wrong?
Hello, dear viewers. Thank you for watching our channel, Wisdom of the Bible. I personally invite you to subscribe to our channel. It supports us and helps us create more videos. Thank you, and God bless you.